I was just looking for my headphones, and they were already on my head. Anyway, this is called The Birth of the Eternal, or The Development of Language and the Death of the Mortal. Perhaps language developed a long time ago. Then perhaps a particular pattern in language was later formed and then continued for a while. Like, for instance, this sentence, which only exists in language, but then suddenly and permanently stopped. Now, the beginning and ending of something in language is just how language works. Sentences begin and end. Words begin and end. Sounds and shapes of letters and other linguistic symbols like numbers or punctuation marks are all distinct, isolated bits that have boundaries and beginnings and endings. So the fact that one thing ends and then another thing begins is really just a contrivance in language. Language makes up categorical boundaries and then names the two categories as distinct, like day and night. But day and night, are they really isolated or opposites? Does one end and then the other begins? Is there ever a time when there is neither day nor night? For instance, we can say that night begins when day ends. However, day and night are a single cycle that language divides into a pair, referring to a categorical distinction between the shifting positional relationship between the sun and a particular location on a particular planet. Like in Asia, it's day at the same time as in America, it's night. And then when it's day in America, it's night in Asia. There's always both. And what if you're like on the moon, or if you're on a satellite, on a space station or something rotating around the Earth? Then is it day or night? Well, then you can look down on the planet and say, right over there, it's day, and over there, it's night. In the shadow part where the Earth isn't facing the sun, that's the nighttime. And the part of the Earth that happens to be positioned towards the sun, that's the daytime. That's where day is, and that's where night is. Thus, day does not actually end. Day just moves. More precisely, the Earth is turning, and that turning puts different locations of the surface of the Earth in the place called day, facing the sun. Again, day and night are technically not times. They're just relationships between the rotating of the planet and the light of the sun. They're positions, they're locations, they're places, they're relationships. They're not times, ultimately. So, in a particular place, language can refer to the ending in time of the day as a time. However, day just ends for that place at dusk. Day actually continues as dusk at one horizon or longitude is dawn at another horizon or longitude. So day and night are eternal, but various places move in and out of day and night cyclically. However, language can refer to the ending or beginning of day, like as a real thing. Not just as a construction in language, but as a real thing. The day began, or the day ended. As a convenience in language, the phrase the end of the day is quite useful. However, that does not make it true in any absolute sense. Day and night are not isolated. They are not opposites. They are just categorical distinctions in language. Day does not replace night, and night does not replace day. The planet just rotates to face the day, or the sun, with one section of the planet, and then to face another section of the planet away from the sun toward the night or toward the stars, where the stars are visible without being outshined by the sun. So these are all distinctions in language, and we're setting up a pattern or an example about ending and beginning. But before we get off of this subject of day and night, let's imagine a visit to the polar regions of this planet, like north of the Arctic Circle. A visit way up there would reveal that, in fact, there are places on this planet that do not conform to the popular notions of day and night. In those places, there's no such thing functionally as day and night. Those times of facing toward the sun or away from it are not called day and night in the polar regions. They're called summer and winter. And there's only 2 seasons in those places. Still, there are cyclic 24-hour variations at the poles during the 2 annual seasons of winter and summer, in which the specific brightness of the sun varies throughout that 24-hour period. However, those variations are more like the variation between dusk and midnight. They're just variations in how dark or how light it is. It's not such a contrast as noon and midnight. So even furthermore, in those regions, we could say that there are only 2 seasons, as I said, just summer and winter, and no such thing as day and night. There's no such thing as day and night in certain places. Day and night are places, and in some other places, there's no such thing as day and night. Again, imagine the astronaut in the space station. Is it day or night? Well, it just doesn't apply when you're flying through the atmosphere that far above the Earth, especially if you're near the polar region or something. So we could say that 1 annual cycle of seasons is equal to 1 cycle of the day and night of the gods. And that gets into the language of Mayan astrology and Mayan astronomy and all that kind of stuff. And it's in the Bible and other places, but most people don't understand what that's talking about. And it's not really important what that stuff is talking about. All these distinctions as far as day and night and years and seasons, these aren't really important. It's just setting up for something pretty interesting, but we're not there yet. Along the equator of the Earth, there are day and night, but no seasons. Do you get the relativity of language here? There are no seasons along the equator. Or the variations in season are like really, really small. At the equator, there's no noticeable difference between June and December at the equator, or between April and October. At the poles of the Earth, however, there are 2 seasons, winter and summer, but no day and night. There's no day or night at the poles of the Earth. So day and night and the seasons are actually not times. They are relationships of place. Most fundamentally, they are words in language. Look around you. Is it day or night where you are? What season are you at? You are not in daytime or in winter. You are at daytime and at winter. They are places. Winter in the northern hemisphere of the Earth is simultaneous with summer in the southern hemisphere of the Earth. Day in America is night in Asia. There's always both summer and winter, day and night, and there are always places where there is neither day, night, summer, or winter. There is no beginning and no end to day and night, or to seasons, except in language. Those relationships of place are eternal. But they don't exist except in certain places when language says so. Now, as I said before, I'm not especially interested in any of that, and you might not be either. However, there's a relevance to bringing all of that to attention. The relevance is that you and I are conveniences in language. Just as day is not really a time, but a relationship, there is really no such thing as you or I, except as relationships in language. Likewise, there is no hand without a larger organism to grow it. I and you are manifestations of language. Hand is a manifestation of an organism. There is no earthling without an earth and a sun to produce the earthling. You can't have an earthling without the energy of the sun and sunlight and so on, right? And in fact, there is no sun at all, except in language. Consider, what is the boundary of the sun? Is the sun far away in space? Have you ever said, I'm going out into the sun now? How can you go out into the sun if the sun is so far away? That doesn't make sense. Have you ever said, let's close the curtains and keep the sun out of here? Okay, if the sun is in here, what? Just come on. Is the sun far away, or is it like you go outside and then you're in the sun? Either you're in the sun or the sun is far away. You can't be in it and be far away. Come on, it doesn't make sense. No, it does. It's just two different ways of using the word sun. The sun is a formation in language. There is no sun except as a formation in language. There is no sun at all except in language. The sun does not exist outside of language. The sun does not have a discrete physical boundary or location. There is no the sun until language says there's a sun. Where? There. Or here, or whatever language says. We can say that all the planets are in the sun, or we can say that all the planets revolve around the sun, distant from it, because sun is just a word. Either use of the word sun is useful. Doesn't really matter. It's not a big deal. Similarly, I and you, as constructions in language, they're not that big a deal. We'll come back to that. We can think of the sun as a place distant from a particular observer, or as a process. We can refer to the sun as a measurable distinction in heat, like when it's this hot, that must be sun, and when it's less hot than that, that's no longer the sun. That's where the physical boundary of the sun is where the heat is less than this amount of measurement. Or we can measure the sun in light. Is it this brightness, or is it that brightness, and whatever. Or we can measure the sun, in that case, if you have if you're on the part of the Earth that's facing away from the sun, and you have the shadow of the Earth blocking the various kinds of visible solar radiation, then you say, I'm no longer in the sun. Now I'm in the night. I moved from being in the sun to being in the night. Okay, fine. And there's also, we can refer to the sun as the boundary of the sun as various forms of invisible radiation, such as infrared or ultraviolet. That includes radio waves, sound waves, microwaves, X-rays, and so on. So the sun is a sound. What sound is it? Sun. What is this? What is the sun as light? Well, we can make it up. That's sunlight, and everything else, that's the darkness or the shadow or whatever else. But where does the shadow begin? What makes it a shadow? Well, it's really a distinction in language. There is no sun in the first place. Now, if we say, here's the sun and here's a shadow, then those two as pairs, as contrasting units in language, they're useful. But there's no such thing as the sun or a shadow. There's no darkness, there's no light, until language says so. Remember back in the first book of Genesis? God says, let there be light. First there was darkness, and then God says, let there be light. That's fine, close enough. All right, so ultimately the sun is a linguistic unit that we can say corresponds to various sensory capacities of various organs of various creatures, like the eye organs, right? Or we can feel the sun on our skin and go, oh, now I'm in the sun because I can feel the warmth of the sun, blah, blah, blah. So plants have photovoltaic capacities to convert sunlight to energy. But listen to what I just said. Of course, sunlight is already energy, so that's really a rather weird thing to say. Converting sunlight into energy? Hello. But again, it is a useful construction in language. Plants convert sunlight into energy. What are plants? They're the life of the sun. What's the sunlight? The life of the sun. What's the sun? The life of the sun. Okay, fine. So the sun lives through its various parts, including various planets and the life on those planets or of those planets. Of course, all of these words are also just categories in language. The sun is like, the sun abides in me and I abide in it. It's like a branch in the vines. It's like the Son of God and the shadows of God, or the creations of the Son of God, or whatever. Okay. So I can consider myself a unit operating within an organ of the sun that is labeled humanity. I'm a unit of humanity, as distinct from the organic system called vegetation, right? Clearly, I'm not vegetation, I'm not bacteria, I'm humanity. Now, it may be that 95% of the cells within a particular body that we call a human body are actually bacteria, and that the mitochondria in every single cell of the human body is also bacteria. But we'll say, I'm not bacteria, I am sun, I'm not vegetation. No, I'm not sun. Am I sun or am I not sun? I forget. Anyway, I'm not bacteria, I'm not vegetation. I am animal. I'm earthling. I'm humanity. I'm primate, and I'm not sun. And I'm me. Okay, great. That's something that language can say. So I can consider myself a unit operating within an organ of the sun, a group of solar units, solar life called humanity. Just as the brain has no functionality without the other nerves, there is no real functional boundary between my nerve cells, my organs, like my brain, my organism as a whole. Like, can the organism as a whole operate without all the nerves? Is it meaningful as an organism without all those nerves and all those other stuff? No. There's just distinctions in language. Now, there's no functional boundary between my nerve cells, my organs, my organism, the earth on which my organism relies, and also the linguistic subcategories of me. All this language. This language wouldn't be happening without sun. This language is the language of the sun. Oh my God. And even the sun and the rest of the living universe have no functional boundary between me and language and it and so on. Language makes up all these divisions. Because it can. All right, so categorical distinctions in language are just linguistic conveniences. Seasons do not really begin and end. They're just linguistic labels for distinct aspects of a single cycle. There's always winter and there's always summer somewhere, except when it's spring and fall. So there's an alternation. It's either spring and fall at the same time or summer and winter at the same time. Why? Because that's what the language of summer and winter and spring and fall refer to as it relates to the different hemispheres of the Earth relative to the sun. So we could divide the annual cycle into 4 seasons or 2 seasons or any other number like 12. The complete cycle in itself is fundamental to seasons. Seasons aren't fit together to make an annual cycle. The annual cycle is the fundamental thing, and it can be subdivided into seasons, and those seasons can be subdivided into days. But the real unity is the more fundamental thing, the bigger thing, we could say. So the complete cycle itself is fundamental to seasons, not the particular number of verbal categories into which we divide the cycle, like 365 days make a year or 4 seasons make a year. Well, a year is a year, and you can divide it in any variety of ways, and they don't change the fact that a year is a year. It's like measuring heat in Fahrenheit or Celsius doesn't change how hot something is. Measuring it in months or days doesn't change how long a year is. Measuring a distance in time or in inches doesn't change what distance is. The number of linguistic divisions is merely arbitrary, 12 or 14 or 365. We could divide the annual cycle into 4 parts or into 12. If we divide them into 12 and call those months, it is silly to say that 12 is the right number of divisions and 4 is the wrong number of divisions. Of course, language can say a lot of silly things and pretend that they're not silly, but it would be silly to say 12 is the right number and 4 is the wrong number. The divisions are just linguistic distinctions. They have no inherent reality except as linguistic units that correspond to a single cyclic pattern of time and of place. Right? It does matter. What's the relationship between the sun and the earth, and in particular, a certain place on the earth? Are you below the equator, facing away from the sun? At a certain point in the Earth's revolution around the sun, then we say it's fall and it's nighttime. It's autumn and it's nighttime. But at the same time, as it's fall and it's nighttime, it's also spring and daytime somewhere else. And it's also on a polar region, neither daytime nor springtime nor fall nor nighttime. Rotating or on a satellite, on a space station, going around the Earth, none of those times apply. None of those places apply. More specifically, while the cycle of day and night is obvious from the equator, and the cycle of seasons is obvious from temperate latitudes of the Earth, neither of those is especially useful at the polar regions. So people who've traveled the entire planet, including perhaps the poles, may have found it useful to divide the annual cycle into 12 units, roughly correlating to lunar cycles, or lunation phases of the moon. So instead of using day or night, or winter or summer to mark the varying relationship between the sun and a particular place on the planet, the language of months, or zodiac signs, add a third element. Through the course of the year, and the year is just a pattern in language, but through the course of the year, the sun's position relative to the Earth can be measured against a set of star groups or constellations. Alternatively, the annual cycle can be marked by the stellar backdrop at which the moon is full. So we could say, where is the sun against those stars or constellations? But the fact is, we can't really see the stars very well when the sun is in those places. So technically and functionally what happened is that astronomers and astrologers and so forth, they looked for where the moon would be full, and then they could figure out, you can't, again, at new moon, that's when the moon and the sun are lined up from any particular position, like on the Earth. So what we're really looking at is they timed the months by the full moon, and then they, back figured where the new moon was, and that's how we got the annual cycle of 12 months, or moon units. So a full moon is when the moon is directly opposite the sun from the viewpoint of the Earth. And we can distinguish 12 different months, as the full moon is against 12 different groups of stars or constellations. The moon makes 12 cycles of lunation phases each year, with one phase beginning in each of the 12 zodiac constellations. It's actually at least 12, but we'll go with 12. So, again, one may ask, is it better to divide the annual cycle into 12 or into 4 or what? 365, 7,429? Again, what that question is asking, is it better to divide the annual cycle in a particular way? That's kind of a weird question. It's a rather odd formation in language. Dividing something into 4 linguistic units, or 12, or 365 is for different purposes. Each purpose has its own number of categorical divisions. So when dividing the year into days, 365 is the right number to use. So there are 4 equal parts of each year, as well as 12 nearly equal parts, as well as 365 equal parts, or 365 and a quarter, whatever. All of those divisions in symbolic language are valid and useful. They're distinct. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. They're just different models, different linguistic categorizations or dividings of an annual cycle. And here is where it gets really interesting. To divide life into individual units of linguistic identity, like I, is one valid, useful operation in language. However, fundamentally, I does not exist any more than summer or June, which are just arbitrary words or units in language. I is just a categorical distinction, a relationship, a convenience. Recognize the operation of language as I, which, recognizing, is the death of the mortal, which technically never really existed anyway except as a label in language. You're not really an isolated ego of linguistic alienation. You do not really exist, at least not as an isolated life apart from the rest of life. There's life. Life talks, that's language. Life divides itself into categories, that's language, and so on. Life is simply operating. Language is simply operating. Language claims the categories of humanity and non-humanity, left and right, up and down, mortal and immortal, I and not I. Just as left cannot die, because left is just a unit of language, the same is true of sun and day and I. Left doesn't end. Left doesn't die. Sun doesn't end. Sun doesn't die. Sun is a construction or a label in language. I doesn't begin and end outside of language. I only begins and ends as a unit or convenience of language. Day only begins or ends as it relates to language constructing it. The eternal cannot be born. I named this the birth of the eternal, but I'm telling you now, the eternal cannot be born. The eternal is always here. To recognize that you are the eternal movement of language can be called the birth of the eternal. Though a useful phrase in language, it is also nonsense, but so is the death of the mortal, because there is no mortal outside of language. Language is simply operating. The sun is not even really shining. Language makes up that there is a sun and a witness of the sun, and that the sun is shining light, and so then language says, I am over here, and I see the sun shining, which is way over there. No, I am the sun. Who else am I? Language. Who's the sun? Language. Language declares the life of the sun. Language declares the life of the mortal. You can't really say the life of the immortal because, again, it doesn't apply. Life and death apply to mortal. Beginning and end apply to mortal. Immortal doesn't begin, doesn't end. You don't even call it alive. Language is immortal. Fine. Without language, there is no sun and no mortal. The sun, those are just labels. The sun does not give life to the earth, and the earth does not give life to the earthling. Language divides one thing into 4 or 12 or 365. Language may claim that the sun gives life to the earth, but from where? The sun gives life to the earth? Really? Are the sun and the earth really isolated? That'd be like the sun gives language to the earth. Really? Is that how it is? Outside of language, what is the boundary between the sun and the earth? Is the earth in the sun, or only part of it's in the sun? I mean, come on. How can only part of it be in the sun? Isn't that a little weird? Well, not in certain very useful constructions of the word sun. But remember, sun is just a construction. It's not really out there. Sun is a linguistic unit, a category. What is the boundary between the front of a piece of paper, the back of that same piece of paper, and the edges of the paper? What's the boundary? Front, back, and edges are just distinctions in language. Paper is also just a distinction in language. When language notices the operating of language, that can be called the birth of the eternal, the awakening of consciousness, enlightenment, the death of the mortal, the creation of life, and the developing of language. Further, once language notices the operating of language, language may or may not stop claiming to be something other than language. Language may say, I am worried about surviving, and I am even more afraid of dying. Because language likes to rhyme. Language may also say almost anything. Almost anything. Though, of course, language cannot actually say anything, because if I know one thing for sure, I know that there is no such thing as language. There is just me, and I cannot be language because I say that I am not language. I am over here, and language is way over there, and I can notice it happening, like happening to me. Language controls me, and victimizes me, and tricks me into pretending that there is a devil, and that I am not language, and that language does not even really exist. That's why I'm an atheist, which means I don't believe in language. By the way, there is one thing that I know for sure, and it is that God is omnipotent and the creator of all things, which is why God is terrified that the devil might defeat the influence of language and ruin everything. I mean, what if the devil makes a time machine and goes back in time and stops God from making up the devil? Then what? Thanks for listening to The Birth of the Eternal.